Hi scholars, happy Thursday. You should be getting out your packet to page 143 to 146. We're going to be reading chapter 6 in our unit 9. Chapter 6 is called The Quest for Clues. The link to our reader is in the video description below, but right now you should be getting out your packets, opening to page 143. Our do now for the day should be familiar. It's a sentence combination using 3 small sentences. Our sentences are: fool's gold is called iron pyrite, metallic gold is very hard, and fool's gold and metallic gold look very similar. How can you combine all 3 of these into one sentence? Using things like commas and transition words. Think of transition words like and, but, and so. Take a moment to complete that now before we move on to our daily objective and our vocab for the day. Our daily objective, I can analyze how Amy's point of view influences character descriptions using text evidence. So today in chapter 6, we're going to be looking through one of our main characters, Amy's eyes, and then using her perspective or how she sees the world, describe other characters, some of our suspects and other people with evidence. Some vocabulary first. Repeat along so you memorize. Flushed. Flushed is an adjective. It's a reddish color, usually the face. Not like you flush the toilet, but if someone's face is flushed. It's when your face gets really red and all the blood rushes to your face. Usually when someone is embarrassed by something, you might see their cheeks get really red. It also can happen if you've ever been really cold before. You might get like really red on like the tips of your cheeks and your fingers. It's all the blood rushing there for warmth. Trace. Trace, the noun. It's a slight mark. A slight mark. Genuinely. Genuinely. Adjective. Honestly or authentically. Authentically might be another vocab word. It just means honest and real. So if you've ever had authentic Mexican cuisine before, you've probably had it from someone who's lived in Mexico or Spain before, someone whose family has connections there. It's honest or authentic. It's real. It's genuine. So if someone's trying to convince you of something, they better speak genuinely and not sound shady. The opposite would be incredulous. Incredulous. It's disbelieving. So if you are incredulous, it means you don't believe it. I was incredulous when the teacher told us I had to do 200 pages of life work tonight. You didn't believe them, it was disbelieving. Weaving is moving back and forth. Weaving. Think of a boxer bobbing and weaving back and forth, not like weaving a basket, but weaving as in moving back and forth. Slither. Think of a snake, slither. It's a verb, sliding along. The snake slithers across the ground. And then pry. Pry is to use force to open something. So if someone has a crowbar or like a metal pole, they might put it into a door as leverage and pry it open. Your word work for the day. I was incredulous when ... Finish the sentence. What might you be incredulous about? What might happen that you disbelieve or didn't believe? So here's an example. I was incredulous when a flying saucer landed right on my roof. You couldn't believe it. You were in shock. Or 2, don't pry open the blank because blank. Don't pry.
Before we get started reading Chapter 6, The Quest for Clues, on page 35, let's go over a prediction and a big question. The big question of this chapter is, what are chemical reactions? So if by the end of this chapter, we're going to be able to define a chemical reaction. So before we get started, I want to give you some time. On the space below, you have lines. Before we read, I want you to predict how is a chemical reaction different from a physical reaction. Take a moment, fill in the lines below. Just a prediction. You can correct it and go back later. Remember, a physical reaction is something that changes the physical properties. That's something like the color, the size, the weight, the look or feel of something that with one of your senses you can identify. What is a chemical reaction then? How is it different than a physical reaction? Take a moment, fill it in now, before we move on and begin the chapter. We're now going to start reading on page 35. Get out the digital reader, starting at the top of page 36. 35, I apologize, at the top of chapter 6. We're not going to finish chapter 6 today. We're going to only read half of it and then fill out some questions. Tomorrow and Friday, we're going to finish out chapter 6, though. That way we can start chapter 7 when we come back next week. Starting at the top, when Amy arrived at the breakfast table the next morning, it was obvious that something was wrong. Tess and Dr. Forrester both looked tense, but no one at the breakfast table was talking. For once, even Felix was quiet. Amy slipped into the chair behind Matt and asked softly, "What's going on?" "Not sure," Matt whispered back. "They said they have something important to tell us, but wanted to wait till everyone was here." Julian was still missing. They all waited in silence until he finally came, running up, flushed and breathless. "Sorry," he said, taking the last chair. "I overslept." Dr. Forrester clasped her hands on the table in front of her. "I'm afraid that Tess and I have some disturbing news. This morning, when I went into the lab to see if the consultant I applied to the gully fossils last night was dry, I discovered they were gone." "Gone?" Amy exclaimed, her heart suddenly pounding. "All of them?" Felix asked, eyes wide. "Yes, every single one. We looked everywhere, of course, but haven't found any trace of them. I can only conclude that someone took them during the night." She paused and looked hard at everyone at the table, one by one. "Did any of you see or hear anything strange last night?" Amy shook her head and shot a glance at her fellow campers. They all seemed genuinely upset and denied seeing or hearing anything other than the rhythmic creaking sound of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. "Then I can only conclude," Dr. Forrester said with a heavy sigh, "we were the victims of a very clever fossil thief." "People steal fossils?" Matt was incredulous. "Who'd want to make off with dinosaur bones?" "Oh, you'd be surprised," Dr. Forrester said grimly. "Fossil hunters supply museums and private collectors all over the world. Most are honest people who obey the laws about where and how they can collect fossils. But unfortunately, there are some unscrumptious characters who dig up fossils on protected lands without permission, or," she paused, "steal them from paleontologist dig sites." Let's take a moment then, before we move on to that next chapter, just look back up at that last unscrupulous. So let's look at some context clues to try and figure that word out. That's not in our vocab list for the chapter. We now know our prefix un means not. Scrupulous, let's take a prediction or a guess. Think about it. These are people who go around stealing from other people or land without permission, and they're generally a group of people that most don't like. So, would we say that they're honest, or would we say that they're maybe shady? Most scholars would probably say they're shady. They're people you wouldn't trust, or just kind of bad people to be around. They're unscrumptious. It means that they're not honorable. These are people who don't care about the right thing to do. Moving on. Starting in the next paragraph, halfway on 36. "Since none of us heard anything," Dr. Forrester continued, "I'm guessing the thieves parked their vehicle some distance from the camp and then slipped in and out of camp on foot." "That SUV we saw yesterday," Felix mused, "that was pretty suspicious. Do you suppose the thieves were in the SUV? Maybe they were spying on us." Dr. Forrester shrugged. "It's possible, Felix, but it's just as likely that what we saw was nothing more than a car turning around." "What if the thieves come back?" Daria asked nervously. "For the first time this morning," Dr. Forrester smiled, "that is the good news." Sorry, one more time. For the first time that morning, Dr. Forrester smiled. "That is the good news. I doubt very much that they will, because they took the only fossils we have in camp right now. I can't imagine they'd return." "Shouldn't we call the police or something?" Matt asked. "Well, there aren't really police out here," Tess said. At least not like those in the city. But Dr. Forrester and I are discussing what to do." Tess served eggs, and bacon, which put everyone in a better mood. But while the campers chatted excitedly about fossil thieves and stolen bones, Amy was trying to think like Inspector Ellis. She guessed that the big thunderstorm had washed away the little fossils into the gully, but had also smoothed away any tracks and footprints on the ground around camp. If fossil thieves had parked a vehicle nearby and walked into camp during the night, there should be clear sets of new tire tracks and boot prints to be found. She added this possibility, followed by a question mark, to the list in her notebook. Amy slipped out of camp while the others were busy making breakfast, making lunch, and packing up the excavation gear. She circled the cluster of tents at a distance, scanning the ground in open areas and dry gullies wide enough for a vehicle to drive along. Wherever she looked, the sandy soil was rain-flattened and smooth, except for tiny footprints she guessed that were made by ground squirrels and rabbits. There were no sign that anyone had approached their camp from outside the night before. Finding no clue is a clue in itself, Amy thought. Remember that statement for later. Finding no clues is a clue in itself. How is it a clue if there's no other clues? Convinced she had made a thorough search, Amy headed back to camp. She was weaving through several clumps of tall grass when someone suddenly shouted, "Stop!" Amy froze as Julian appeared off to her left, hurrying towards her. "Don't take another step, Amy," he called out. "Stand absolutely still." She was about to ask why when she saw the snake emerge from a big clump of grass not 5 feet ahead and start slithering towards her. Amy's mouth went dry, and cold sweat beaded her skin. I want to pause right there. Look at that. Let's evaluate that last detail they give us. Amy's mouth went dry, and cold sweat beaded her skin. What do these details tell you about her? So think for a moment. She sees a snake popping out, and then her mouth goes dry, and then she gets this cold sweat feeling. What would we describe this as? A lot of scholars might say this is what someone who's scared or afraid might look like. These are physical reactions. They're describing her body and how her body would physically react to this scare. So they're not just going to say Amy was scared. They're giving us more details to show instead of tell. Picking back up, out of the corner of their eye, Amy saw Julian pick up a rock the size of a baseball. "I'm going to toss this rock so it lands between you and the snake," he said worriedly. "Hopefully the snake will go in the opposite direction and head away from you." "Hopefully?" Amy thought as her heart thumped harder. Flipping the page to the top of 38. "Are you ready?" Amy wasn't sure she was, but she took a deep breath and said, "Ready," in a tight, squeaky voice. Julian chucked the rock and it landed exactly where he said it would. The snake stopped, tensed, and then turned and wriggled away, leaving a thin S-shaped track in the sand. Amy's breath went out of her in a huge rush as Julian came running up. "That was too close," she said in a hoarse voice. If you hadn't stopped me right then. Anyways, thanks." "You're welcome." He looked around and looked back at Amy. "What are you doing way out here?" "I was looking for tire tracks and footprints," Amy admitted, "to see if I could spot where the fossil thieves had parked their vehicle and where they walked into camp." "Oh," Julian said, looking at her and quickly glancing away. "Did you find any?" Amy said she hadn't, but then something occurred to her. "So Julian, what are you doing out here?" We're going to stop right there, the bottom of the page where she's confronting Julian. I want you to look at the next page. We have a set of questions. Or rather, we have a set of questions I want to go over first, and then we have some opinion statements we're going to break through before we end for the day. So, on my right here, we have a set of questions. We're going to review Amy's actions in the text today, and we're going to fill out a chart to show what she did and then what she saw. So it already fills it in for us what Amy did. Let's read the first example. Amy added a possibility in her notebook. So she had a thought when they were talking in the morning. She added a possibility. Yesterday, the soil would have been smoothed by the rain. So if fossil thieves had parked and walked, there should be clear tire tracks and footprints. So a possibility, she remembered, hey, there was rain last night. Let's go out there and see if I can find some tracks. It would make it very obvious. Filling in our next two. Amy did what Amy did. She slipped out of camp. And then what did she see when she left the camp? She only saw footprints of ground squirrels and rabbits, tiny footprints, nothing like people. And then she had the thought, finding no clue is a clue in itself. There's no clues here, but that is a clue as well. Think about that. We're going to talk about that in a moment. I already know I mentioned that once, but we're going to save that for the very end. And lastly, returns to camp and talks to Matt. That's going to happen actually towards the end of the chapter, but I think all of us should be able to figure out at this point, if there's no tire tracks or boot prints around the camp, that means they didn't come in or out. They're already in the camp. So we should be able to already know the thief is one of us. We're going to see how everyone reacts to that news, though, tomorrow in our chapter. Lastly, we're going to answer some questions to see if you've been paying attention. A few of these are opinion. Number 1, what was Amy looking for and what did she find? Filling that in, restating beneath number 1. Number 2, Amy says no clue is a clue in itself. What does she mean? If you're still confused, take your best guess. No clue is a clue in itself. If there's no other evidence, why is that a clue? Think about it. She walked around the camp and couldn't find any clues of people coming and going, and that turned into a clue in itself. Number 3, do you think the evidence supports the theory that the fossil thieves arrived in a black SUV or a pickup truck? Do you think there's enough evidence in the story so far for the theory that the thieves came from a truck or a black SUV? And lastly, do you think Amy's deduction was correct? Why or why not? Do you think her deduction that one of them is the thief, or thieves, there might even be more than one, is correct? Why or why not? So you have to explain either one of your answers. You're just filling these in beneath the questions. These need to be restated, complete full sentences, not fragments. When you're done, you can actually go ahead and send me a photo for an extra grower team point. In the meantime, scholars, tomorrow and Friday, we're going to be wrapping up the ending of Chapter 6, and we're going to have another chart that we're going to fill out to talk about chemical reactions. Today, we really didn't talk about the chemical reactions, but it's going to be our big question as well for tomorrow. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to call or text. I hope you all stay safe and have a great day. Bye-bye.